All right. Danny Garcia versus Errol Spence is a possibility, and there's a lot of pressure out there for that not happening. I have what I think is a unique solution, and the only way that fight should happen, if it should happen at all. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel, subscribers. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, thank you to the supporters that watch the video all the way to the end and give me the responses to the questions that I ask and ask me questions so we can chop it up in the comment section. Also, thank you to everybody that goes to that is a Patreon, our Patreon community, and thank you to everybody that comes by the live streams, specifically OG Boxing Talk on Sunday mornings, 8 a.m. with myself, Blood Boxing, KQKC Boxing, and Kurt Sugar. Now, let's get into this. All right, so last weekend, we know that Errol Spence Jr. fought Shawn Porter in an absolutely epic battle. It was a great fight, did very, very well on pay-per-view. I haven't heard anybody say that they were not thrilled by that fight and thought it was a terrific fight, right? Now, in the aftermath of such a wonderful fight, people go back to their respective camps and we begin arguing with each other again, right? I make fun of Terrence Crawford fans. Terrence Crawford fans tell me that Bud Crawford would dog walk Errol Spence, right? Some people, the Shawn Porter fans, some of them say, hey, he won the fight. I tell them, hey, go check BoxRec, right? So we go back and forth. We have these really good conversations. But one thing that happened after that fight was over that I have not had anybody tell me they thought was a good thing was in the immediate aftermath of the fight, Danny Garcia got into the ring and they kind of announced that, or I don't know if it was an official announcement or if it was a call out, what it was, but the conversation began about the very real possibility that Errol Spence Jr. in his next fight could defend the WBC belt and the IBF belt against Danny Garcia. Now, we know Danny Garcia is. Danny Garcia is a former 140-pound champion, top dog at 140 pounds when he was there. He moved up to welterweight. He won the WBC title, the same title that Shawn Porter has, and who Shawn Porter won that belt off of after it was vacated by Keith Thurman. So Danny Garcia is now in position and they're beginning to talk about him fighting Errol Spence Jr. for that belt. And there's a lot of blowback from that, and rightfully so. The fights that people want to see, and I think it's fair to say that the fights that people want to see, number one is Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, because that's what's been being talked about before the Shawn Porter fight, right? And the story going into the Shawn Porter fight was, look, this is an acceptable fight because Shawn Porter is the WBC champion. It's a unified championship. So, you really can't make an argument that Errol Spence shouldn't be fighting him. But that's not the case with Danny Garcia, because Danny Garcia does not have a belt. Danny Garcia has lost to Keith Thurman. He originally lost his WBC belt to Keith Thurman. Then he went for the vacant title when it was dropped by Keith Thurman. His belt was then dropped by Keith Thurman after Keith Thurman's long injury, or during his long injury, and he lost that to Shawn Porter in a very good, very close fight. So it's two times that he got a shot for the WBC belt. I think 3 times, right? So he's 1 for 3. He's 1 and 2 out of 3 for shots at the WBC belt. And I don't think anybody really believes that he's that upper echelon of welterweight champion. So why would he get a shot at Errol Spence instead of giving Shawn Porter a rematch, or having Errol Spence Jr. go and try to fight the WBA champion Manny Pacquiao, right? And I think everything that people are saying about that these are very valid. Though I think that there's a way that fight with Danny Garcia would be an okay fight to have happen, right? But it would for me, it would be under a certain set of circumstances. Now, similar to the fight with Errol Spence and Sean Porter, where I was like, look, man, I want to see the Terrence Crawford fight. I wanted to see the Manny Pacquiao fight. But hey, if we can't get those fights right now, Sean Porter's a good fight because he's a champion. So I say the same thing about Danny Garcia, but the only situation that I could see that would justify a fight between Errol Spence and Danny Garcia is if he became the mandatory. Because if he became the mandatory, that would not accomplish as much as a unification fight between like Errol Spence and Manny Pacquiao or Errol Spence and Crawford, but it would get rid of the one of the major obstacles that are in the way of unifications at any weight class, and that is the existence of mandatory challengers. If Danny Garcia is the mandatory, and he's not, because he's number one as of the time of this video, he's ranked number 1 by the WBC. And I do believe he's number 4 by the IBF. If the IBF and the WBC, well, the IBF, Errol Spence Jr. fought, yeah, he's going to be due for mandatory for the IBF in not too long. And the IBF don't play about those mandatories. The IBF will strip you. You've seen that with Canelo Alvarez. IBF will take, if you don't fight your mandatory and you're not in a unification, IBF will take that belt away from you. They are very firm about that. The WBC will be a little more lenient about allowing you to do different things in order to, to satisfy their requirements, but not the IBF. So what I would say is, if all else fails, okay? First of all, the fight with Sean Porter, Errol Spence Jr. says he wants it. Sean Porter wants it. It did well monetarily. It's already, it's a spectacular type of matchup. It's a style that clashes two styles that work very well together. That was kind of Ward Gotti-ish, like at a very, very, very high level. The fights that they talked about was that the early 90s, mid 90s, late 90s, the Arturo Gotti, Mickey Ward fights where these guys were going blood and guts with one another over several fights. Man, that's what Sean Porter and Errol Spence Jr. style looks like at a much higher level of fighter. But still, that style melds. So I would prefer that fight. But you know how funny business goes on in boxing. So at the very least, Errol Spence Jr.'s team should insist that if they have to fight, if say people are just, you never know how boxing works, I'm on the outside in. But look, if you're gonna make me fight, somebody in there that has the power to do that is gonna play around and make me fight Danny Garcia because they made Danny Garcia a promise, or they feel like, that's going to make a lot of money and then we can move on. They want Errol Spence to be part of that plan. Then get with the WBC. Whoever that is should have to get with the WBC, get with the IBF, and force that to be a mandatory. Force that to be a mandatory title defense. Because if it's the mandatory title defense with the IBF, if it's a mandatory title defense with the WBC, then he gets with Danny Garcia, who's, by the way, ranked again number 1 by the WBC and number 4 by the IBF, that if that becomes a mandatory, then that gets that out of the way, which would allow him to have more, and he's able to beat Danny Garcia. That would allow him enough leeway to have a Sean Porter rematch, a match with a match with Manny Pacquiao, and a match with Terrence Crawford. And without having any issues about mandatories popping up, at least from the IBF and the WBC. Can't speak for the WBO because the WBO is whatever Bob orders, but that's going to stay over in his camp. That's going to stay in their camp regardless. So if that fight has to happen, and people play games in boxing for sure. Sean Porter, after he won the belt off Danny Garcia and Errol Spence Jr. got in the ring, said, "Hey man, if this Errol Spence Jr. fight doesn't happen next, it's not because of me." Right? There's some politics going on. I believe it after seeing Sean Porter's performance. Hindsight is 2020. Hey man, I have a tendency to believe him now. Didn't want to believe him before. I did call him a ducker and all that. But the way he went hardcore in that fight, man, you got to know that dude believes himself. But that's my take on it. If Errol Spence Jr., I want Errol Spence Jr. to fight Sean Porter next, because that is a rematch. That is a surefire, great fight that we just saw. Get that rematch done. Both fighters want to do it. Make it happen, right? If you can't get that, then get the Manny Pacquiao fight or the Terrence Crawford fight. And quite honestly, I would take the Manny Pacquiao or the Terrence Crawford fight equally for me. Because and I've said this in videos, and a lot of cats that don't appreciate that I say this, Terrence Crawford has not fought anybody at welterweight yet. And I think that a 3 belt unification fight for Terrence Crawford is funny to me. Just similar to how Bob Arum made him the mandatory for Bob Arum and the WBO had him as mandatory for Jeff Horn before he ever fought, before Jeff Horn even fought a fight. Now he wound up fighting a fight in between the time that he was named that Crawford was named mandatory and the time that he fought Crawford, but he was named the mandatory right after the Manny Pacquiao fight. And it's like, look, man, I know I like Terrence Crawford. He's a great fighter, all that good stuff, man. But look, what's fair is fair, man. What's fair is fair. Everybody in that division has fought somebody that's a top guy in that division except for Terrence Crawford. So I would take Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence just as quickly as I would take Errol Spence Jr. versus Terrence Crawford at this point, out of a sense of fairness. But anyway, it is what it is. Let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, what do you think about them becoming the mandatory, my theory about how that could work with Danny Garcia. And with that, I'm out. Peace.